Hello, everybody. I'm back. So let's talk about the 1960s, one of my favorite eras. I'm going to pull up, so I had to make a list of things to not to forget to talk about because there's a lot. I'm going to try to keep it from being too long, though. So I'm not going to go over everything because I don't want this to be an hour and a half long. So make sure y'all do all the reading assignments and the videos. But let's talk about the early 60s. So Kennedy was elected in 1959. He became president in 1960. And this was the first, and the presidential debate between him and Nixon in 1959 was the first televised debate. And many people think that Nixon would have won if it weren't televised because it was like Kennedy just looked better on TV. He did a better job for the camera and he was younger and better looking and just kind of looked better. So that really influenced people's vote. So it was a very close election. Another reason why Kennedy won is because right before the election, he helped get Martin Luther King out of jail. So King's dad took it upon himself to mobilize African Americans to support Kennedy. And so that seemed to kind of be the tipping point. There's a lot about the Supreme Court in the early 60s that I want to mention. Some of it goes past the early 60s, but while we're on the topic of the Supreme Court, I just want to give you some important landmark decisions that happened throughout the 60s. Earl Warren was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from, oh gosh, I should have checked on the dates. I don't have the exact dates, but basically from 1954, he was the Chief Justice during the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So he either became Chief Justice in 54 or maybe 53. But he remained Chief Justice until the either late 60s or early 70s. During his reign on the Supreme Court, a lot of important decisions were passed. So, of course, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. In 1962, the Supreme Court banned official prayer in school. This was done on the grounds of separation of church and state. Kennedy supported this because he was Catholic. He was the first Catholic president. I guess we're about to have our second or maybe third. There haven't been a lot of Catholic presidents. And Kennedy did not feel like schools were the proper place he felt like there should be separation of church and state. So in 1962, official prayer of public schools was banned. The Supreme Court shortly after also struck down laws that made it a crime to have obscene materials. So there was an act passed in the late 1800s, like 1880s, called the Comstock Act. And that act made it a crime to send, quote, obscene materials through the mail. So things like anything that mentioned birth control was illegal to mail. This law, this new Supreme Court decision that struck down the Comstock Act had a lot of impact on the gay rights movement because prior to the Supreme Court saying, no, it's no longer a crime to mail obscene materials, prior to that point, it was a crime to mail anything that had to do with homosexuality. So the gay rights movement seemed to get off the ground very slowly, but it was illegal for them to send like materials in the mail about the oppression against gay people. So the Supreme Court struck down that law and said, no, it's no longer illegal to mail obscene materials. And that was a big plus for the gay rights movement. In 1965, the Supreme Court struck down laws against contraception. This was also extremely important. It was no longer a crime in any state for doctors to give out contraception or for people to talk about it or for stores to sell it. That became completely legal. In 1966, the Supreme Court ruled in Miranda versus Arizona, and this is where we have the Miranda rights. The Supreme Court said that every person who's being arrested must be told their rights. In 1967, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Loving versus Virginia. The Supreme Court ruled that states cannot ban interracial marriage. They said that it is unconstitutional for a state to ban interracial marriage. So interracial marriage became legal in every state in 1967. And this particular court case had a big impact on gay marriage, which was just a few years ago, because people who were arguing in favor of gay marriage were saying, well, Loving versus Virginia already set the precedent that states can't restrict people's rights to marry. So the Supreme Court had a really big impact during the 1960s, and a lot of the civil rights movement successes originated with the Supreme Court. I say originated, I don't mean that the Supreme Court brought them about. They were the ones to give a ruling on a certain issue. So make sure you read about the freedom rides in the textbook. Well, I'll skip that for now. And also make sure you pay special attention to Birmingham, 1963, with Martin Luther King and his efforts, and all the people who worked with him, their efforts to desegregate Birmingham. I usually show photographs in class, but every time I try to show something on a Zoom video, it never works. But there's a lot of famous photographs from Birmingham in 1963. And you see a lot of children, a lot of African-American children sitting in. They're sitting in all white places, and they were, asking for the end of segregation in their city. And the police chief of Birmingham was extremely aggressive in his opposition. He used really powerful water hoses and attack dogs to attack these protesters. The protesters were being extremely peaceful. This was an age of nonviolent protests. But the police chief responded in a very violent way, and a lot of photographs were taken and publicized around the world. There's famous photographs of kids with the fire hoses directed at them, like really powerful hoses. And there's photographs of police dogs attacking protesters. And these photographs are what many people believe changed President Kennedy's opinions on the civil rights movement. During Kennedy's first 2 years in office, he was pretty, he didn't seem to care that much about the civil rights movement. He was preoccupied with the Cold War, things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. It's not that he ever expressed blatant opposition to civil rights. He just didn't seem to be too concerned about it. After Birmingham in 1963, he definitely seemed to shift a little and started to more actively support the goals of the civil rights movement. So Birmingham in 1963 was where Martin Luther King was jailed. That's where he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail that y'all need to read. In August of 1963 was the I Have a Dream speech at the Washington Monument. Y'all have seen the pictures, I'm sure. Up to that time, it was the biggest mass gathering in American history. And this is where King made that famous I Have a Dream speech. In November of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. And obviously, y'all know there's a ton of different conspiracy theories regarding Kennedy's assassination. I will say that there is a lot of evidence that shows that the mafia was involved with this. I went to the Museum of Underground Crime in Las Vegas, and there was a lot of information there. Very, very strong evidence that this was that the mafia was involved in Kennedy's assassination. I'm not going to get too much into it here, but it's really interesting. Kennedy had a big role in the Bay of Pigs event in Cuba, and after Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, Castro was a communist. America was very much against Castro, very much against communism coming to, so close to us. So Kennedy became very adamant about trying to kill Castro. The American CIA really wanted to kill Castro. And they couldn't do it. They tried and tried and tried, and it's a pretty crazy and like almost unbelievable story of how the CIA tried so many times to kill Castro. And they even got the mafia involved, and the mafia was more than happy to try to kill Castro, because when Castro came to power, he eliminated the casinos in Cuba. And before Castro came to power, Batista was the president of Cuba, and he worked very closely with the American mafia. The American mafia had a lot of gambling rings in Cuba, and so Castro like ruined all. And so the American mafia was very, they wanted to get rid of Castro. So they worked closely with the American government to try to assassinate Castro, which didn't work. But all those assassination attempts are what led Castro to ask the Soviet Union for protection from America. And this is why we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's a video y'all need to watch about that. So that's all I'm going to say about it here. I just wanted to mention it because it kind of, to know the extent of the involvement of the mafia with Kennedy and with Cuba, it helps explain why the mafia would have been involved in Kennedy's assassination. All right, so after Kennedy was assassinated, the country was devastated. People loved Kennedy. Like I mentioned, by this time he had become a bit more supportive of the civil rights movement. So even a lot of African Americans were very upset about his assassination. It just kind of created this dark cloud over the country. Shortly after, in January of 1964, the Beatles debuted in America on the Ed Sullivan Show. And the Beatles brought rock and roll back to America. So the video about the 1950s and rock and roll, I talked about how rock and roll was killed in America. It basically died in 1950, 59. People in America were saying, thank God that fad's over. We can rock and roll. However, in England, rock is still really popular. American artists like Chuck Berry, Elvis, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, they were still very popular in England. So people there were, celebrating American rock and roll, but it was here in America. But then when the Beatles came in January 1964, they are said to have brought American rock and roll back to America. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson took over as president. He was a big fan of FDR. He was a big fan of the New Deal. He really loved the idea of a strong activist federal government that worked to, change society. President Johnson was also a big supporter of civil rights. So he was a genius in getting legislation passed. He is the president who got more legislation passed than any other president except FDR. And after Kennedy's death, he took it upon himself to get a major Civil Rights Act passed. And this became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the way that he got it passed was he basically told members of Congress this was Kennedy's last wish. Before Kennedy's death, he became a supporter of the civil rights movement, and he was kind of formulating this act, and then he was assassinated. So in his honor, let's pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was a genius thing for Johnson to do, because who could, vote against something that their slain beloved president had been in support of? So Johnson basically went to every member of Congress and gave them the so-called Johnson treatment, where he basically pressured them into supporting the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it was successful. The act passed. And it's one of the most important acts in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation and discrimination in public places. So 10 years prior to that, Brown versus Board of Education outlawed segregation in public schools. And then after that, we see the bus protests from the Montgomery bus boycott. They outlawed segregation in interstate travel, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation and discrimination in all public places. So it basically ended the Jim Crow. It ended the separate water fountains, seating areas. All of that became illegal. Since 1964, this act has been added onto. So the original act called for no discrimination in public places, no discrimination in employment of race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. And later on, more things were added. So sexual orientation and national origin, was added on to this later. And it's interesting that gender was part of the original Civil Rights Act of 1964. A congressman who was opposed to the act, added gender into it, thinking that that would keep it from being passed, but it passed anyway. So this act banned discrimination in public places and in employment on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. So every time you apply for school, like Ball State, or a bank loan or a house or anything, you see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you see a statement about non-discrimination, and that is because of this legislation. So it was a really very important piece of legislation. Make sure you guys read about Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and Mississippi Freedom. I don't want this to take an hour and a half, so I'm not gonna describe all that right here, but please read about it in the textbook and then watch the video, the short video from Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It's pretty important. So by 1964, people were sort of very motivated by the successes of the civil rights movement. And Malcolm X was becoming a popular figure. And he actually took a lot of ideas from Marcus Garvey of the 1920s. He at first was in favor of Black separatism. First was in favor of by any means necessary. So this by any means necessary was a direct repudiation of the non-violent philosophy of the civil rights movement. So as I mentioned last week, the civil rights movement was all about nonviolent protests, peaceful protests. And that meant not fighting back if you're attacked. If you're beat up, you just sit there and take it. You don't fight back. That's what it means. So Malcolm X disagreed with that. No, we need self-defense. We need to embrace self-defense. So it's not that he was embracing violence. He was just repudiating nonviolent protests, because nonviolent protests meant that you don't defend yourself. So by any means necessary became more of an aggressive idea for the civil rights movement starting around the mid 1960s. Malcolm X, before he was killed, he did change his mind on Black separatism. Before he went to Mecca, he was very much against white people, like very actively, like racist against white people. He changed that mindset shortly before he died. He was shot and killed in February 1965. In 1965, President Johnson, Johnson was reelected in 64. I shouldn't say reelected. It was the first time he was elected. He became president when Kennedy was assassinated, but in 64, he won reelection. He won by a landslide. So he felt like this was his chance to really get a lot of things done. He initiated his Great Society program, and this was a lot like the New Deal. He called for a war against poverty. So the Great Society was all these new acts that were meant to end poverty, provide better care. So the Great Society created Medicare and Medicaid. The Great Society provided a lot more federal aid for education. It eliminated the quota system on immigrants. So think back to the 1920s, the Immigration Act of 1924, that severely limited immigration. Johnson's Immigration Act overturned that. So it made immigration available